Good evening, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for coming out on a dark November night. We do think about moving this lecture to May, and then we think, oh no, people will be out surfing all the time until midnight, so they won't want to come to a lecture. So thank you for coming out on a dark November night and joining us for the Buchan lecture, which is one of the highlights of our calendar. We're very pleased to have a special guest all the way from New Delhi via Amsterdam and several cancelled flights joining us tonight. But first I want to say a little bit about the Elphinstone Institute, the host of this event and a place where I've worked for a number of years. I'm Tom McCain, director of the Elphinstone Institute, and we are a department of folklore and ethnology. We study culture, we study traditions, and traditions old and new. Sometimes old ballads and sometimes very contemporary practices, things that people do every day. And really what's behind a lot of our work is the idea that culture matters. Culture makes a difference to us in everyday life. And we mean that, I should have actually spelled it with a small c, we mean culture with a small c. We don't mean necessarily operas and ballets, but the folk traditions that surround operas and ballets are still folklore, and the everyday culture, the way that you have all been conversing tonight, is probably folklore. You know what happened to me yesterday, you won't believe it. That sort of story that we tell each other is all about how we pass culture along to each other and how we create community. So we study language and education. We promote Doric language and the Scots language through language classes and evening classes as well. We research music, song, and story, skills and crafts, feeding into tourism, trying to create a tourist experience that is slightly different from shortbread and whiskey only, but actually the sort of experienced everyday culture of the Northeast, the songs and stories and legends and everyday stories that we tell each other here in the Northeast. And traveler culture is another specific interest of ours, and a way that we partner with the traveling community to help give voice, I guess, to their culture and to their important place that the role they play in Scottish history and Scottish culture and Scottish tradition. Don't bother reading this. It says culture helps people. That's UNESCO's statement on cultural sustainability and why culture can feed into policy and help laws and policies match what people do and want and need, and vice versa, help people understand the policies that help shape the world around us. So through these kinds of traditions, we rehearse our future. We narrate stories about ourselves, the things that we tell each other about each other and ourselves. The customs, that's things we do together collectively, which create kinds of community and connections. And skills, learning to do and make things together, passing along skills. And we might think of the very traditional skills like boat building or net mending or something like that. But we all teach each other skills all the time. How do you do that? Every time I talk to Nick at the office, he learns something about how Word works that he didn't know before. And so we teach each other these things, and it's not just what we teach, but it's how we teach them. It's how we're next to each other, demonstrating things to each other, and passing along information by all sorts of linguistic and non-linguistic ways, the ways we communicate as communities. Culture is a resource for us to express ourselves in distinctive ways, in regional ways, in very local ways, in community ways, also in national ways, hopefully from my point of view not nationalistic ways, but the idea of being proud to be Scottish or proud to be Northeast or proud to be whatever you are. And in my experience, when people are self-confident about their own identities, they are much more welcoming of other people's identities. I don't mean arrogant in their own identities, but confident that their culture is important, and they're much more open to other cultures being important. And I think that increases understanding. And through reclaiming our cultural heritage or claiming it or expressing it in community-based ways, we can build social and economic resilience. We can build the tools in ourselves that help us weather the storms of unpredictable lives and world around us. So here at the Institute, we explore culture and identity. We research tradition and creativity, understanding function and meaning, why people do things, what it means to them, both as individuals and collectively. Why do we do things together in certain ways? And the whole process of doing that. As I said, the process of learning from each other in certain ways, just by watching somebody do something or by explicit instruction. The process of how traditions and ideas pass between us is very, very interesting. We work in co-production with partnerships with communities and individuals so that we don't just set the research agenda at the Institute, but we talk to communities and groups and get a sense of what's important to them. And with that sort of reciprocity, that two-way dialogue, we devise things that we feel need to be researched, or the research questions derive from things that communities and individuals want to know about their culture and about the process and about the communities here in the region. And through public events, of course, we interact with the public in a broad way as we can. Our partnerships obviously can't be partnerships with everybody. We have quite a lot of them, you know, something like 120 sort of organizations that we work with here in the Northeast. It's a lot, but it's not all of the people in the Northeast, of course, and so public events gives us a way to reach out to a wider audience. And I'll welcome the people that we have online watching this evening's talk streamed around the world. So welcome to all of you, wherever your time zone brings you. And I'm only sorry you can't join us for oatcakes and salmon afterwards, although I'm not sorry because that would be far too many people eating it. So cultural sustainability. We need our culture to be sustainable because it builds social resilience. It increases cultural equity. You know, no one bit of culture is more valuable than another, and all of these cultural expressions that we talk about and that you all have should be considered to be equally valuable. And that contributes to community health, community interactions, and community resilience, making connections between people and fostering parity of esteem between groups and cultures. So sustainable societies is something that comes out of an understanding of culture. And the new tagline for our department, folklore is more relevant than it might appear. So without further ado, we'll get on with the 2023 Buchan Lecture, named after David Buchan, Aberdeenshire folklorist, family from up the northeast coast there, with a name like Buchan, obviously. And he was an outstanding folklorist, one of the outstanding folklorists of his generation, who studied legends, contemporary legends, and Scottish ballads, and wrote some very innovative work on Scottish balladry. And he was the first director designate of the Elphinstone Institute, and unfortunately passed away just before he was able to take up his post. And so this lecture has been launched to keep his name alive, and we use some of his readings in our master's course as well. And it's a great pleasure to be able to honor his legacy and his memory here in the Northeast. So moving on to our lecturer tonight, we have a special guest, Sadhana Naitani from New Delhi, from the Jawaharlal University in New Delhi, in the German department. And she is, her research interests cover European and Indian folklore and how colonialism plays out as a kind of two-way highway of information and understanding and prejudice all rolled into one. Very interesting work on colonialism and folklore. She's an author, a filmmaker, and a novelist, or a novellaist. So quite a broad list of achievements, and also president of the International Society for Folk Narrative Research. So without further ado, I will invite Sadhana to speak with us about how stories are more relevant to our lives and our world than they might appear. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McKean, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me for this very, very prestigious lecture in the memory of a wonderful folklorist. So, and thank you to the University of Aberdeen for hosting me. I'm indeed very, very delighted to be here. I have known of the Elphinstone Institute for quite some time, but this is my very first visit to the Institute, not to Scotland, but to Aberdeen and to the Institute. Thank you all for coming to this lecture this evening, and I hope we will share some ideas about culture through stories, and actually what old stories or new stories, old stories that remain new stories actually, and what meaning they could have for us today. So as you probably know, the title of my lecture is When Humans, Animals, and Plants Talk to Each Other. The most distinguishing feature of folklore is its multi-species world, a world where humans, animals, and plants talk to each other. In fact, not only them, even the waters may speak, as also the earth and the sky. In this world created in folklore, there is a language that is mutually understandable by humans, animals, plants, waters, the earth, and the sky. This is also a feature that exists in folklore of all regions of the world, notwithstanding the fact that the human world is divided by languages, making it difficult for one people to understand another group of people. However, everyone can imagine a mutual and shared language with animals and plants. That itself, that it is a global feature of culturally specific folklores, makes it a subject that requires our attention and requires us to ask, what does folklore achieve by breaking boundaries of communication between humans, animals, and plants, or between boundaries of communication between different species? Today in this talk, held in the memory of a great folklorist, David Buchan, who established the social and historical significance of Scottish ballads and legends, I will revisit folklore, particularly the Indo-European folktale, to reflect on this question. What does folklore achieve by breaking the boundaries of communication between different species? This question, I believe, needs to be asked because of two features of our own times. One, almost 1 million non-human animals and plant species are threatened with extinction in the near future. As per a report of the United Nations released in May 2019, based on Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service, IPBES, prepared by 145 expert authors from 50 countries, based on the systematic review of about 15,000 scientific and government sources. And for the first time, a committee like this took into account, quotes, indigenous and local knowledge, particularly addressing issues relevant to indigenous peoples and local communities, quotes close. In summary, the report stated, quotes open, the overwhelming evidence of the IPBES global assessment from a wide range of different fields of knowledge presents an ominous picture. The health of ecosystems on which we and all other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. We are eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health and quality of life worldwide, quotes close. These facts signal that our appreciation of animals and plants is at an all-time low. I would call the present state a deeply fractured ecology, where human beings are being held responsible for their role in the environmental crisis and are also emerging as the victims of the same. While environmental crises, as reflected in the climate change, is seeable, the ecological crisis, that is the relationship between humans, animals, plants, and earth, is often seen only in fragments like extinction, deforestation, and the like. I think behind the environmental crisis, or even its cause, is the fractured ecology, where the communication between humans, animals, and plants has been breaking down over a very long period of time. In this context, the multi-species world of folklore needs to be reconsidered. Can it be useful to us in some ways? Two, the second feature of our times is increasing awareness and effort to heal the fractured ecology. Individuals and groups across the world work tirelessly to save animals and plants and their habitats. In certain cases, governments have supported the efforts too. In scholarship of humanities and social sciences, the emergence of new thought leads a change in perspective, and in natural sciences, new discoveries and research bring forth data that challenge simple rationalist thinking. So let us see what happens in the world of folklore, particularly the folktale. Folktale is a wonder tale. The story moves with the use of magic. Folk song and ballad are probably more realistic, but they too are not without magic and wonder. The folktale's popular opening, Once Upon a Time, disconnects the recipients from their own time and transports them to an unspecified time. Herein, the story starts in a normal, identifiable situation. An orphan child faces abuse. A young man has to prove himself. A young woman is held captive and must escape or be rescued. An elderly man faces neglect. An old woman becomes too wise for the comfort of society. A non-human animal suffers ill treatment by humans. A tree is inhabited by ghosts. A river weeps, the ocean devours. To resolve or change their situation, these characters must act, and as they start to act, the story enters a fantastic space where there are forces with different abilities. A helpful human with magical powers, several non-human animals with amazing abilities to help the heroes achieve their aims, plants with magical powers, trees that listen to what travelers resting in their shade talk about, stones that move when some magical words are chanted, mountains that are made of glass, sky speaks, and the earth itself opens up. In search of their goal, the characters will move across land, underwater, and fly in the sky, and might transform into other forms of animate life or inanimate objects. Anyhow, they will achieve their aim and come back to the normal situation, which they have bettered with their achievements, and then live happily ever after. And this happily ever after is never alone for the hero, but in a community. This structure with many variations is a trope that defines the Indo-European folk narrative and applies in varying degrees to other folklores. As we know, the world of folklore is a multi-species world that includes fantastic species too, like dragons, 100-headed serpents, and others. The world of folklore is incomplete without the appearance of supernatural forces, and that may include the divinity itself. In my understanding, three categories define the world of folklore: sentience, conflict, and cooperation. So let us see what sentience is in folklore. When the Pied Piper of Hamelin played his pipe, the rats followed. And there was no doubt in the mind of the storyteller about the ability of the rats to respond to music. In an Indian tale, a woodcutter comes across a tiger who was in pain from a thorn stuck under his nail. The woodcutter removes it, and they become friends. Woodcutter's entry and work in the forest become safe henceforth. One day he invites the tiger to a party at his home. The tiger comes before anyone else and takes his seat. Guests, human guests, as they arrive are alarmed, and the woodcutter says, "Oh, don't worry, that's my dog." Party goes smoothly. Next morning, the woodcutter walks back to the forest with the tiger, and when they are there, the tiger asks the man to strike his head with the axe. The woodcutter resists, but on being threatened, does as he is told, strikes the tiger's head with his axe, giving him a skin wound. Tiger asks him to leave and come to see him only after a few months. When the woodcutter meets the tiger again, the tiger shows him his healed wound and says, "This wound that you gave me on my body has healed, but the wound you gave me by calling me your dog will never heal, and therefore our friendship is over." The storyteller did not doubt Tiger's capacity to feel insulted and cared about the dignity of other beings. A sentient storyteller narrated a sentient tiger. Folklore proceeds from this intellectual position that all animals are sentient. While the possibility of a mutually intelligible speech between humans and animals is not borne out by any evidence, it is well known that animals and birds understand each other. When a tiger moves in the forest, every bird and animal calls and is understood not only by their own species, but by all others. People living close to forests also learn to understand these calls. Human understanding of animal sentience has gone through different phases in human history. In the pre-modern world, animal sentience was not in doubt, although its impact on reality might have varied. In certain contexts, this acceptance of their sentience granted them protection from being hunted, and sometimes also granted them sacred status. The acceptance of the sentience of the plant world, too, impacted their status in human society. And the rivers, mountains, and oceans were persons with their own biography and genealogy. All this was communicated amongst human beings in the form of stories. For no matter how fantastic, every folktale is rooted in reality. Several indigenous communities believe that they originated from a tree or rock or mountain or lake or an animal. That belief is communicated and disseminated through one or more stories. The point is not whether these can be proven as true or false. The point is that these stories create the perception that humans are connected to other animals and natural phenomena in a genetic manner. In Hinduism and Buddhism, the idea of rebirth is that one will be reborn in all other species. Human birth, though special, is not the only form of life we will experience. This way, people understood that the essence of life is the same in all living creatures, and that understanding did impact the way they treated the animals. The second important category in folklore is conflict. Acceptance of sentience does not rule out conflict between members of one or more species. In a Tibetan folktale, a tiger calls his sons before he dies and tells them the tiger is the king of the forest and hunts other animals, but he must be wary of the animal called man and never try to hunt or kill him. He then dies. All his sons obey him, but one is more curious than the others. So he goes out in search of man, and along the way comes across a worn-out pack bullock and an ancient elephant worn out with scars and cuts behind his ears. They both tell him how cruelly the man used them and left them to die when they could not work for him anymore. The young tiger still goes ahead to test the man and finds what he had heard to be true. In the famous German folktale, Die Bremer Stadtmusikanten, the city musicians of Bremen, 4 domesticated elephants, overworked by their owners and left to die when unable to serve, become a group and occupy a house to live in. There are several conflicts between different species in the folk tales, but none are so vicious as those involving human beings. Foxes are cunning and cheat others, crows steal from others, etc. The folk tale's awareness of the role of man in the scheme of things is amazingly diverse and intricate. As the most cunning and dangerous animal, as a compassionate being that saves others, as a character that established his superiority over others through violence. But I have never really come across a tale where a non-human animal acts in a manner as to cheat, harm, or kill the human. They outsmart the human at times, but do not pick up a conflict on their own. This representation of the humans by human storytellers points to a self-reflexive ability. As a storyteller, man can see and narrate the role of man rather critically, as manipulative, violent, cunning, and destructive towards other beings. In other words, as the single biggest cause of conflict in the natural world. At one level, such stories are evidence that violence of human beings against other forms of life is nothing new. But at another level, such tales play a role in encouraging critical self-reflection on the part of humans. This unstated role of such folk tales becomes further corroborated by stories of cooperation amongst species. In difference to the stories of conflict, the stories of cooperation reflect new possibilities. One tale that reflects the quintessential logic of interspecies cooperation is the one in which a lion just sitting happens to see a mouse and clamps down his paw on him. The mouse pleads to be spared by promising to be of help to the lion at another point of time. Lion is amused by the suggestion that a rat thinks that he can help a lion and lets the rat go. After some time, lion is caught in a net trap placed by the humans. Here comes the rat, and with his sharp teeth cuts the net quickly, and the lion is saved. Cooperation, we learn, is not based on similarity, but on difference. Each one may have different abilities. The question is, can we help the other with our own means? This is a tale of coexistence, which has innumerable variants across the world. Equally widespread is the plot that the human hero, in quest to achieve a challenging task, is helped by many different animals. Their help comes from their own abilities. Cinderella is helped by the pigeons to pick up the grain from the floor. Legendary heroes are helped by birds, reptiles, and mammals in their heroic achievements. A young lad out to search God is guided along the way by a cow, a horse, a rabbit, and other animals, who also give him a task of their own: get the answers to our queries. 2. When you meet the God. On his way back from mission accomplished, he meets all these people and shares the knowledge he has gained. In certain stories, they even accompany him back to his house. If looked from the perspective of cooperation, we see that the folktale's hero becomes a hero through interspecies cooperation. And in the happily ever after picture at the end of the tale, there are not only human beings, but people from different species. Human heroism is in slaying a mythical dragon and in being able to enlist the help of other species. Folktale's hero is loved by the poor, the distressed, the animals, and benevolent supernatural beings. These features of the folktale have been put away as merely fantastic, but no, they are presenting a worldview. Humans can coexist with other animals on this planet. These others can empower the human with their abilities, and the human too can do something for them in return. Killing other species is not the only option for human beings. So let's see what these three categories together, science, conflict, cooperation, imply. Scholars have wondered about the folkloric relationship between human and non-human forms of life. acknowledging sentience of all, possibility of interspecies conflict, as also possibility of cooperation, and tried to find its causes. At times, folklorists located it in the fact that in the pre-modern world, humans lived in close proximity with domesticated and wild animals and plants and trees. Therefore, they were aware of their dependence on the non-human. In other contexts, as of, as of the indigenous communities, So in other contexts, as of the indigenous communities, it is known to be part of the overall worldview of the community. The United Nations report mentioned earlier noted that the areas still owned by traditional indigenous communities, which is about a quarter of the world, are formally protected or have low human intervention. And accordingly, the rate of environmental degradation is way lower, but is under pressure from outside interventions. In yet other contexts, as in India, the reasons for environmental protection are believed to be rooted in philosophies of Buddhism and Hinduism, which believe that life is the same in all beings and do not differentiate between human and non-human in essential terms. But colonialism's intervention changed that in a major way. In those times, that is, pre-modern times across the world, it is said, folklore was not children's literature, nor just entertainment for adults. Instead, it played an epistemic role in creating and inculcating knowledge and values. Thus, it impacted the way people related with the world and other beings. This impact can also be seen in negative ways. For example, wolves suffered extinction in real, partly because based on their image in folklore as dangerous and anti-human creatures. Donkeys have been treated as stupid rather unfairly. Bats are symbolic of dark, dangerous, and haunted places. These images may have little to do with reality, but their power overrides the reality. On the other hand, some definitely dangerous animals like the cobra snake finds reverence in India due to the folklore about them. So the world of folklore is firstly a multi-species world, and secondly, a world of fluid boundaries between humans, animals, and plants. They talk to each other, and that conversation has consequences. This raises two questions. One, when did folklore stop playing the role of creating ecological consciousness and become reduced to merely a form of entertainment? Two, how does knowledge generated by folklore compare with contemporary and rational science-based knowledge about the non-human world of animals and plants? To answer the first question, when did folklore become mere entertainment? Let me remind you how all the early collectors of folklore in the 19th century Europe claimed that folklore was about to disappear under the pressures of modernity. The cause was seen to be located in the disruption of agriculture-based communities, migration to industrial cities, and the spread of rational scientific knowledge that did not support notions that humans, animals, and plants could talk to each other. The reasons were, however, more deep-set. They were rooted in the change in philosophical perception. Scholars trace it back to Descartes, who insisted that animals could not think and were therefore to be treated like machines. I think, therefore I am, the famous phrase, I think, therefore I am, has extremely negative connotations for all other living beings, except the human. While it is not possible within the limitations of today's talk to go into the history and development of this thought on the European continent, let alone compare it with others, suffice it to say that rationalism in philosophy combined with rational science and its application in the industrial society created the perception that man had conquered nature. In this world, folklore did not disappear, but lost its value as a source of knowledge, as it was identified as not rational and too fantastic. Folktales, art and craft of storytelling impacted modern literatures, like magical realism when we think of literature. But folklore itself lost its position in society and became mere entertainment. Let us expand this view to look beyond the European continent, and we will see these ideas of modernity coming in contact with other epistemologies on the planet in the context of colonialism. Historians are only now beginning to look at the impact of colonialism on environment and ecology of the colonized. As European colonialisms circled the planet, civilizations in America, Australia, Africa, and Asia became embroiled in the creation of global modernity. I would illustrate this briefly with some examples from the Indo-British shared history. While taking control of India's forests and her free and wild animals, the biggest resistance to British power came from beliefs held by the people. Forests that people considered sacred and did not want to cut down. Animals had identities and status based on their role in certain stories, and people were unwilling to simply see them as game. By and large, all animals were considered sentient, and several had protection from hunting. One small example is that of snakes. Colonial state promoted and paid people to kill snakes, but achieved very little and could not understand the ways of coexistence practiced by the people with regard to such a dangerous animal. The belief that snakes remember those who kill their mates and come to take revenge governs the way people deal with snakes in India. Ordinary, unarmed people intervened when they saw British soldiers shooting peacocks and monkeys. Their resistance was so strong and palpable that the government had to accept their objection for fear of protests that could rock the very foundation of their rule and banned hunting of some animals. However, colonialism also implied changes in the education system, and slowly, pre-colonial knowledge systems became unofficial, traditional, read backward, ideas to be replaced by rational science. Ironically, monkeys, peacocks, snakes, and others retained their status derived from stories, while the country lost its material wealth. Several other animals were not so lucky, as they lived in deep jungles. The Indian tiger, rhino, and elephant were hunted to such extent that today they happen to be in the United Nations list of critically endangered species. And that, in spite of independent India banning all forms of hunting in 1971 and pulling the tiger somewhat back from the edge of extinction. Worldwide, as stated earlier, almost 1 million non-human species face the threat of extinction today, and forests disappear at an alarming rate. The second question is, how does the world of folklore, filled with sentient being, compare with scientific knowledge about the world of non-human animals and plants? Is an important one, because folklore is considered almost the opposite of science. The binary opposition that was created between folklore and science in the process of modernity needs to be reevaluated. As we already know how folklore treats non-human animals and plants as sentient, let us see how science and philosophy see these matters in the 21st century. In 2012, the first annual Francis Crick Memorial Conference was held in the University of Cambridge. It announced its subject of deliberations as, quotes open, consciousness in humans and non-human animals, and declared that the conference, quotes again, aims to provide a purely data-driven perspective on the neural correlates of consciousness. The most advanced quantitative techniques for measuring and monitoring consciousness will be presented, quotes close. The text written by scientists played on the proverbial folk knowledge and said, quotes open, until animals have their own storytellers, humans will always have the most glorious part of the story. And with this proverbial concept in mind, the symposium will address the notion that humans do not alone possess the neurological faculties that constitute consciousness as it is presently understood. It is noteworthy that a conference of scientists proceeded with a proverbial concept in mind, and the proverbial concept being an African proverb which says, until the lions have their own historian, the history of hunting will always glorify the hunter. The scientists included brain scientists, neurologists, neurobiologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, medicine specialists, experts from the field of neuropsychopharmacology, biology, and adaptive intelligence, sleep and consciousness, synthetic neurobiology, and theoretical cosmology, as represented there by none other than Stephen Hawking himself. The conference concluded with a declaration signed by the participating scientists. Quotes open, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates, quotes close. In simple words, the conclusion was, non-human animals are sentient beings. Many scientists are building on this research today, and certainly no one believes anymore that animals are governed by instinct alone. Scientists and organizations are trying to have states accept animal sentience, and their task is a difficult one because that acceptance would imply many changes in laws and businesses. Even more recently, books concerning the way trees not only communicate with each other, and this too is shown by scientific research, but there are popular books as well. So these books concerning the way trees not only communicate with each other, but also help each other in times of stress, have made their way to the newspapers and therefore to the general public's awareness. Susanna Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree, 2021, and Peter Wohllebens' The Hidden Lives of Trees, 2015, are examples in point. Sales of their books in hundreds of thousands across several countries and continents are also evidence of people's interest in the subject and willingness to accept that trees communicate with each other, care for each other, and nurture their neighbors while living in symbiotic relation with fungi. Some scientists believe that there is too much storytelling in this, and that trees communicate and cooperate, but not in human-like sense. However, at the popular level, knowledge is best communicated and remembered as stories, songs, and especially proverbs that encapsulate the wisdom of many in a few words. All this reminds me of two so-called true stories that stand in the cusp of folklore, rational doubt, and empirical evidence. Jim Corbett, the very famous author of books on man-eater tigers of Himalayas, was himself located in that cusp. A third-generation Irishman in India, born in 1875, whose family never even visited Ireland, grew up in a humble family on the foothills of Himalayas in the company of the local village folk. In 1920s, he was asked by the British administration to solve the problem of man-eater tigers in the region, as he was a good shot and well-versed with the language and beliefs of the local people. Jim Corbett shot man-eater tigers, but wrote to inform the world that this phenomenon was not natural, but created by the British hunters. He became the first advocate of modern conservation policy regarding tigers. Corbett depicts the jungle as a place of rich interspecies communication. Several instances in Corbett's work challenged his reason. In one instance, a village priest told him that he will never be able to shoot the tiger he has come for. That tiger used to hang out at night outside the village temple and was thus seen by the people as a devotee and called the temple tiger. Over 8 days, Corbett got the tiger in 4 situations where he should have been able to shoot him, but could not, as strange things happened at the last minute. Corbett left that tiger alone. In yet another instance, he was on a mission to shoot a tiger that lived in a forest where there was a shrine of a local deity. The belief was that the deity protects all, and therefore, customarily, no hunting could take place in the vicinity. When he himself decided to shoot a tiger that was killing cattle in the villages nearby, he was careful to select a spot a mile from the Baram's shrine. That was the local deity, Baram. Although he was not a believer of the deity, he waited behind a bush. The tiger appeared on the track as expected and started walking towards Corbett, who needed the distance to lessen between them before shooting. When the tiger was at about 100 yards, there was some rustling of the trees, and Corbett saw a young tree beginning to tilt, then rest on another, and then both started to tilt towards the ground, taking yet another small tree with them. Quotes open, and that's Jim Corbett. At the first sound of the tree, the tiger had come to a halt, and when the trees crashed to the ground, he turned and, without showing any signs of alarm, walked back in the direction he had come from. What made the occurrence I had witnessed so unusual was that the trees were young and vigorous, that no rain had fallen recently to loosen their roots, that not a breath of air was stirring in the forest. And finally, that the trees had fallen across the track leading to the shrine when the tiger had only another 70 yards to cover to give me the shot I was waiting for. Quotes close. Rationally, the event was not explainable, but it was remarkable. Corbett halted in his tracks in the middle of 2 worldviews and reflected on it, when many others would have simply dismissed it as superstition. In Corbett's attitude is a clue to the way we can understand the talking animals and plants. The point is not to prove whether it is right or wrong, possible or not, but to see that such folkloric beliefs accept the possibility that animals, plants, and humans might be connected in ways yet unknown to us. Beginning with Descartes, who believed animals cannot think and feel, the increasingly enlightened, rather rationalized world started believing differently from the folktale. Philosophers and culture theorists today have started to identify the problems in the rationalist worldview, popular since the advent of Enlightenment and modernity. More recently, in the 20th century, the modernist paradigm's binary of culture and nature as 2 distinct and different spheres has been critically denied most effectively by contemporary French anthropologist philosopher Philippe Descola. Referring to the change in perceptions in the modern time, he says, quotes open, "Gentle Mother Nature was forgotten, and nature, the cruel stepmother, had disappeared. All that remained was a ventriloquist dummy of which man could make himself, as it were, the lord and master." Quotes close. He challenges the modern culture-nature binary on the basis of studying indigenous communities in Amazon forests. Contemporary perspectives on the non-human animals proceed by challenging the binary of human and animal. Critical human-animal studies have sought to analyze the basis and history of the binary as also to change it. British philosopher of Indian origin, Richard Sorabji, his seminal work, Animal Mind and Human Morals, The Origin of the Western Debate, 1995, is an extensive analysis of the question of human and animal in the Western philosophy since antiquity. Quotes open, "We too have lived through a period when endless ingenuity was spent on maintaining the behaviorist view that all animal behavior can be accounted for in terms of stimulus and response. Now, at last, an open-minded effort is being made to discover what cognitive states we should or what we shouldn't ascribe to various species of animals. Quotes close. Proving the importance of non-human animals to our habitat and to us, American biologist Joe Wheaton studies riverscapes and advocates, quotes open, low-tech process-based restoration of riverscapes, quotes close. He has shown how with the introduction of beavers in their former habitats close to a river, the entire riverscape changes with their activity for the benefit of other fauna as well as flora and the humans. Beavers, it may be recounted, were indiscriminately hunted through the 19th century as pests and for their fur. Based on Wheaton's work, philosopher Battista Morizot speaks of a metaphysics of alliance with other species. The colonial representation of non-European peoples as brutes or primitives is now considered wrong. Referring to this realization, renowned novelist Amitav Ghosh asks, quotes open, what then if they, the moderns, were wrong also about the inertness and brute materiality of what they called nature? What if it was the people who were regarded by elite Westerners as brutes and savages, the people who could see signs of vitality, life, and meaning in beings of many other kinds, who were right all along? What if the idea that Earth teems with other beings who act, communicate, tell stories, and make meaning is taken seriously? Quotes close. He goes on to tell that today, scientists are in agreement that trees communicate with each other. But, quotes open, the Indian scientist Jagdish Chandra Bose demonstrated long ago that plants can feel pain and fear and even make audible responses to certain kinds of stimuli. His work was hugely celebrated for a while, but then the agents of official modernity struck back and silenced him as a charlatan. Quotes close. Ghosh is referring to the power structures of knowledge created in the process of modernity and colonialism. Modernity versus primitivism, science versus tradition, and even European versus non-European scientists. What I'm saying here is similar power structures of knowledge have also been applied to folklore in relegating it to a position where it was no more seen as providing knowledge. Colonialism, rationalist philosophy, advent of environmental destruction, and downgrading folklore as are historically simultaneous phenomena. In today's atmosphere of critical analysis of modernity in humanities and natural sciences, should we reconsider what we have considered merely fantastic or at best metaphorical worldview embedded in folklore? When humans, animals, and plants talk to each other, when humans, animals, and plants spoke with each other, the world was not free of conflict, but it accepted the sentience of the other and the possibility of cooperation. Am I saying that these stories need to be told again? No, I don't have to say that because they continue to be told. We need to connect with the worldview embedded in folklore to relate with the stories anew, and more importantly, tell new stories that say that humans, animals, plants, water, and earth exist in a dynamic tension with each other, and that since only the humans have disrespected this network, they need to unlearn their imagined superiority in the larger scheme of things and relearn to coexist with the others. Folklore, old and new, can play a role in realigning our damaged relations with other species, water and earth, because it is through stories that we make sense of the world. The impact of traditional stories on reality is visible in several grassroots movements today. People in Hawaii, for the last few years, resist the installation of a telescope on a hill that is a person in their folklore. The river Wanganui in New Zealand was granted personhood recently after 150 years of legal cases filed by the Maori in modern courts of law. Ecuador has declared all animals as legal persons. The river Ganges in India has been granted legal personhood when it has been a person and a mother to a civilization for over 2 millennia. But legal rights are required today to protect her from industrial pollution. Accordingly, in institutions concerned with the studies of law, animal rights has become a major concern, and it is to be seen if and how this will impact our perception of human rights. To conclude, the fractured ecology, as I call the current condition, can only be healed by changes in our perception of other life forms on the planet Earth. Folklore has been sensitive and empathetic to the relationship between humans, animals, and plants. It has been narrating several contemporary issues of ecology, of shared habitat between humans, animals, plants, and others, in its own creative and imaginative ways. Those imaginative solutions contain possibilities to rethink what is ecological balance and what role can humans play in creating an ecologically just world. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. We'll have some questions, but first I'd like to invite Tara Bini from our own School of Language and Literature and Music and Visual Culture to offer just a few reflections on Sadhana's talk, and then we'll open the floor to some questions.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm really delighted I'm able to kind of kick off the discussion just now. But yeah, thanks so much for such a wonderful talk, and also so relevant for us today. I mean, I think like many people in the world, I have a sort of deep concern about the ecological state of the world, and so this really is a really powerful reminder of the importance of stories and the ways that stories help us to kind of really shape and make sense of the world. This is really fascinating for me. I'm Tara Bini from German department. I also work in sort of literary studies and comparative literature. And I've written a book on metamorphosis, so sort of maybe just one aspect of this kind of wider picture that you're painting of, you know, the possibility of boundaries breaking down boundaries between humans, animals, and plants, and the ways that folklore allows us to access those different ways of thinking. And once we can think not just from our own habitual perspective, but from other perspectives, and to look at ways in which animals are sentient, and I found it really persuasive, the case that you made for what you call folklore addressing the fractured ecology, the breakdown of communication. I have sort of so many different things that I'd like to follow up, and I'm sure everyone here does as well. I'm not quite sure where to start, but I was really wondering, you know, you gave some really fascinating examples of the ways that we've sort of reclaimed some of the knowledge, like the folklore, like the knowledge that's enshrined in this sort of way of thinking about other beings in a way that is kind of allows a kind of closer access to that experience. And I wondered about, you know, these examples of the sentience of plants and of animal rights, and I wondered if you see a sort of resurgence both scientifically but also in terms of folklore and of the importance of sort of folklore and stories, and the kinds of stories that we're telling today, and what you see as sort of the general pattern and at the moment. So yeah, it would be great to hear more. But thank you so much, and yeah, I look forward to hearing everyone's questions as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we are seeing a resurgence in many ways. And since you said you come from literature and probably some other people too, in literature we are seeing, especially in the Western world, we are seeing a surge in fantastic literature. Whether you talk of post-humanism and whether you talk of many, many different authors and writers. And this whole idea of fantastic literature or magical realism, as it has been called with reference to Günter Grass, Salman Rushdie, and several other authors. Where does this magical realism come from? The magicalism comes from folk narrative, actually speaking. And so, because I think instinctively people, listeners, and more consciously writers and artists realize very well that actually speaking, the use of magic in storytelling is actually meant to reflect on reality, So it's like that once upon a time you are taken into a place from where you can actually see your reality far better and you can understand it far better. And therefore I find that in a way, we think folklore is just children's literature, but in many other ways, the tools of storytelling embedded in folklore continue to be very important. They also continue to be very important, as I said, in several environmental movements today. Which need to build on, and in some totally new ways as well. For example, if you think of the work of Jane Goodman with the chimpanzees in Africa, how did she, 30, 40 years, how did she build that? How did she build that momentum that the entire world was focusing? Once again, she was narrating, and you read her, and you'll see that the importance she considers that storytelling has. So this whole storytelling about chimpanzees which dwelt across the world and made us realize, see them as human beings, see them as sentient beings, that kind of then garners that support which is required in many ways today to solve the real problems, right? So storytelling is one thing, but how do we translate it on ground? And there we see that every time we get to seeing this, and I'm sure all of you are getting such kind of videos which are circulated, parrot dancing, and they are all actually based, not all, I cannot say, because there's a lot of fake things going around and just cute Archies kind of things going around too. But, for example, certain parrots dancing to music, now they are based on scientific experiments, and therefore today, as I said, the scientists themselves are following some of the things that we have known through folklore and questioning and exploring whether they are really possible.
Thank you very much. Any questions and comments from the floor? Marie, yes.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the interactions between the non-Western ways of interacting with nature and animals and hunting and animals consumption and all of the very extremists with scarecrows, vegan groups and PETA and the SPCA or whatever, who are often encouraging practices that are not environmentally sound and that a scientific community would go against, and the interactions between those kind of worlds.
Thank you for that difficult question.
I'm sorry.
It's a space of debate today. It's a very rife debate, actually speaking. I would not simply say Western and non-Western. I would actually say pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. So I think because essentially all this are a lot connected. So for example, I happened to meet Philip Descola at a conference, and I said, you know, it's very fine that you say that indigenous communities have what he calls alternative ontologies, right? And that ways where these binary of nature and culture does not exist, right? But all these so-called alternative ontologies have been hugely destroyed by colonialism. What seems very far and remote to us is actually not all that remote. We know how much of Amazon has already been destroyed. So in that sense, things are very, very interconnected. Then there are various kinds of groups. I cannot speak to the ideology of all of them, or even the methodology, the way they see them, whether be it the vegan groups or PETA. I think, but everybody is trying to deal with the situation as to how we can have a different relationship with animals and plants. As far as animals and plants too, being food is concerned, all living beings on this planet, I think, survive by eating somebody else, right? That is the law of nature. But the thing is, how do we go about it? I mean, for example, coastal communities that have lived on coasts have always eaten fish, but they did not always send trawlers in the sea. They did not always scan them and trade them and, you know, and make super profits. So that is where I think the debate should be and hopefully will be headed. I think one of the most significant thing in this is that there is a connection that is emerging between scientific researches and people's movements. And that maybe, I think, there might be another time that we might see, hopefully. I like to hope.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the floor? Yes.
It seems to me that folklore will change, and with all these different animals, the different communities will have a different folklore. But surely the most important thing is respect for animals and plants and so on.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. I think without that respect, almost. And the whole idea of having conquered the nature, which is a very 18th, 19th century idea that we have conquered nature. That, I think, that is the attitude which is a problem.
Yes, Ivan.
Thank you. Yeah, I felt just when I was listening to you, I felt a little bit disconnected and panicky in myself, like, oh my God, I've been learning the wrong stuff. There's maybe elders or things that I should be tuning into that I don't know, and I've always maybe not, I think I've always trusted science and things, and like I said, I just felt a little bit disconnected and thought, oh God, there's so much that I don't know as a sentient being. And then I started thinking, oh, I have to be nicer to my houseplants. I have to go to the forest more. I have to tell my children more stories about nature. So I wanted to ask you, like, in your own life, what are your practices to help you feel more connected or to respect animals or all those types of things? Yeah.
Well, I would say in some ways that I think I never really felt disconnected very much. Whether it was my fortune to grow up in a manner that I did not feel disconnected and actually felt more connected and realized that these connections are actually not so real or not possible in reality. For example, I'll tell you my paternal grandfather. I come from the Himalayan region, and my paternal grandfather's stories for our childhood were filled with the jungle, the forest, and all these animals. And I don't know, I learned to question it very recently. One day I thought, why the hell was he telling us how to live with these people. I know everything. If I come across a tiger, what should I be doing? How the bear will behave? And it was never about killing them, but it was strategies you can save themselves. And that animals do not necessarily. And actually speaking, across the hills, people who go into the forest collecting firewood, etc. It's not that if you come across a tiger, he's immediately going to attack you. It's not that automatic at all. So, more recently, I thought, and as I visit the village now, where the forest has receded far more, which was not the case in his time. So I grew up feeling connected. But I have learned to see that those connections are being broken and have broken hell of a lot. And I do not think that today people living in the same village, in the same region, are as aware as he was or are telling those kinds of stories, really. Yes, I think I struggle with more disconnections, and I feel disturbed in many ways. Probably that's why I study folklore.
Thank you. We'll just have time for these two more, because it's getting on. So.
Thank you very much. I'm Warwick Beers. This is absolutely off topic for me completely, so my head's kind of buzzing here. Is the purpose of these connections in stories, is it to entertain? Is it to frighten? Is it to teach lessons in society? And maybe that's what you learn on your first day if you're studying this stuff. I'm just really curious because it does all that. It's an escapism, it's fantasy, but at the same time there can be really serious messages underneath. What's your view on why it exists as a thing that humans do? The whole storytelling and building these relationships.
Oh, wow, that's a fantastic question, really. I think, to take the first part of your question, I think stories, all stories, whether oral or written, all stories are meant for all these purposes. And it depends on the listener or the reader or the recipient, what they make out of it. And sometimes we make the same story stays in our mind, the meaning that it had for me 10 years ago, and it's suddenly today I feel, oh, okay, that was also embedded in it. I didn't see it earlier. So, but why storytelling is there in human society, I think, is a very big question, on which people have probably written. And I think it's probably the most important thing, actually. And that's how we know anything about anything. And as Tom was saying in the beginning, you were probably doing folklore when you were telling, oh, you know what happened to me yesterday? So that storytelling, our own life, the life of others, the moment we start, we never tell the same story twice, even our own, actually. So storytelling is something which I think is, part of the human DNA. And different societies are differently intense with stories. And as was said about the indigenous people, I would say about the whole of Indian civilization, it's a storytelling civilization. Its philosophy is in stories, its history is in stories. And that's why, for example, it was said by the British that Indians have never written their history. Right? And because those history was coded in stories, indeed that makes a difference, because when you tell that means that your imagination, your creativity is involved in telling the stories. But then postmodern theory tells us that all history is written on the basis of so-called documents are also storytelling, right? Because we cannot do otherwise. So I think that's part of our of being human. What probably today scientists and others are saying is that it's not only us who tell stories. It's animals too who tell stories. Several mammals, elephants for example, have a very, very long memory. They communicate. How do these birds who migrate from thousands of miles they migrate, how do those tracks are known to them? How are those routes remain known to them? How is knowledge passed generation to generation, right? So today what we are realizing is that it's not only us who tell stories, who builds knowledge, but there are other creatures on the earth too that do that. And yeah, language stops us from knowing that. So bird brain, for example, is this idiomatic expression that you have less brain, you're less brain, bird brain. But bird brain actually is nano brain. It's highly sophisticated. It's a very sophisticated brain. The way these, so all the knowledge systems that are there, even if we could access it a bit, it would be great. But certainly we are not the only knowledge holders on this planet.
Okay, a final question from the back row here. Yes? Was it Michelle? Yes.
I was just wondering, going from some of the other questions and some of the things you're talking about, with disconnection, you've spoken about the changing of spaces, changing of locations, such as the forest receding. Could you speak a little bit about your thoughts towards these disconnects and the breakdown of communication when the people move? So maybe people who've immigrated to a new space or who have been displaced and find themselves having to connect with nature and animal life, non-human animal life and such, in a place they've not previously been.
Right. Thank you. Human movement, migration itself is actually not at all a new phenomena. It's a prehistoric phenomenon. That's how Earth got populated. And not always did people really reach somewhere and just think, I have to wipe out everything here. Right? They did not. Civilizations settled because people interacted with their habitats where they had moved to. In fact, one of the most recent studies says, why did human beings at all migrate? I mean, from different parts of the earth. And they actually followed animals, because animals migrate as per seasons. Right, as per food. They actually followed animals, and also their domesticated animals, and that's how they reached new spaces and made life and tried to understand and build all this folklore. But in other times, again, what we call colonialism, modernity, people moved to new spaces and wiped out things there, wiped out wildlife. Bison from the American continent was wiped out in the context of colonialism. Several other. But that time, actually, people were being wiped out too. So it's not that necessarily by migration we will become disconnected. We might gain new connections. It is what we are oriented towards. If our migration is not, we have somewhere in mind that I'm migrating to an entire new ecology, and that I will try to understand or try to, become knowledgeable about it, we will do it. But if we just think that I'm migrating somewhere because of whatever, I need to stay in a better house, then we'll not care about it. And that education, actually speaking, is required for us to become those human beings. Because we are actually not simply born in a certain country, we are born on this earth, and therefore we should be able to relate with it in places other than the place of our birth too.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to, in closing, just thank, first of all, Alison Sharman and Nick Lebicre for all their help, or rather their actual making all this happen. And I'd like to invite those of you here in the room to join us for some smoked salmon and cheese from J.G. Ross from Yugi Salmon and Highland Find Cheeses. They're very fine cheeses. One of them is very big. And to thank everyone who's online for joining us. And I think, obviously, finally, our guest speaker, Tara, for having some thoughts to draw things together, and to our speaker, Sadhana, for joining us all this way. It's been a great, if sobering, pleasure to hear your talk tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, and I would like to thank Nicholas Lepierre. Sorry for my pronunciation, but thank you so much. Without you, I don't know, so much of would not have happened for this talk. Thank you all.
So make yourself yourselves at home and eat up.
Oh. Did it make sense?
It makes sense, yes. Yes, very good. Very good.